Um, I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. I've spoken to these summits in the past, and it's great to be in person and not speaking to a computer and looking at myself only. So I've served as a state climatologist for about 7 years now, and every state in the country does have a state climatologist. So we are a science-based trusted voice for climate services. We're like a climate help desk is what I tell people. I view myself as kind of a translator. So I take what Deke showed in the previous talk and translate that. Hopefully I'll do that today into what does it actually mean for us? So what are we seeing in terms of climate trends? What does global climate change mean for us here in Nebraska? And what are some actions that we can, those mitigative and adaptation actions that we can put into place? I also, so I'm in the School of Natural Resources. I teach a 100 level class called Climate and Crisis. For those UNL students, that is available. It's an ACE 9 course. We talk about the science, the symptoms, and the solutions to climate change. I'm a weather nerd. Deke's a meteorologist. I'm a meteorologist by training. I was very interested in weather. I never wanted to go storm chasing. I'm probably the only meteorologist on the planet who's never been storm chasing. I've never had an interest in that. And then I got opportunity to study how the weather influences crops. So I got my graduate degree here at Nebraska in agronomy way back in the 90s. And then I went on to get my PhD at the University of Minnesota by looking at how do we mitigate snow on roadways by using living snow fences. After that, I moved to Alaska and I worked at the university there for 7 years and really got a flavor for climate change that is front and center. I worked there from 2002 to 2009 at a climate office, wrote a book called The Climate of Alaska, and was there for 7 years and then got a job. Here in Lincoln, I used to direct the Regional Climate Center. So Deke mentioned that we have a High Plains Regional Climate Center. So I directed that for 6 years and then fast forward to my role here. So that's just a little bit about me. So let's talk just very briefly about Nebraska's climate past. The 1930s, that was brought up in the earlier talk, the Dust Bowl. That was a really warm period in our historical climate record. It does stand out. It tends to skew some people's perspective. Some people think, well, we used to be really warm way back when, and that's true, but the rate of warming is increasing. Your knowledge of our climate is different than somebody who is my age or older than me. Your perspective is things are changing really rapidly, and that's definitely the case when we look at the data. We've trended toward wetter conditions actually in Nebraska. We've gotten about 10% wetter over time. We've seen an increase in heavy rainfall events, especially if you are from the Sandhills area or have traveled in that area or northeast Nebraska. Those have tended to get more heavy rainfall events than elsewhere in the state. Drought. So we heard a lot about drought during the last presentation. That is a normal part of our climate. So I say we've gotten wetter, but that doesn't mean we don't have drought events. 98% of the state is currently in drought, and we have been for about 3 years now. So that is a normal part of our climate, and it's going to be amplified. Extremes are generally getting worse overall. We had I call it, and I've heard other people call it weather weirding. We had 30 tornadoes in last December. It was really windy this April. We've had flash floods. We have quick onset droughts. All these things that, and Deke had a great explanation of climate and weather. I'm going to steal that for other talks. I say that weather is the clothes that we're wearing today, and climate is the clothes in our closet. Okay, and that's different if you live in Lincoln or if you live in Fairbanks, where I used to, or if you live in Miami, Florida. Okay, so that's a little bit about our climate past. Some things that stand out, and maybe these two examples predate you, but the other ones probably won't. We go quickly from one extreme to another. We had the flood in 2011, which impacted Nebraska and a lot of the central U.S. and Missouri River Basin. And then we had a flash or a quick onset drought in 2012. It didn't last very long, but it was going from too much to not enough. So we're used to dealing with that in our climate because of where we sit on the North American continent. Nebraska's weather is normally weird. That is our norm, but it's getting increasingly weirder. Sometimes that's a barrier for people understanding that, yes, things are changing. They say, well, we deal with this all the time, which we do and we have, but things are amping up. So the 2019 flood, does folks remember that here in the room? So that was a pretty unique event where the setup was really critical. We had a cold winter. We had the highest snowpack, I believe, in Lincoln on record that year. We had frozen soils, and they were saturated soils. And then along comes this big storm in March, and storms are typical during the springtime of year. So we had snow melt at a very rapid pace, and there was nowhere for that water to go but up. So the setup was really key when we had that big storm event come through. March of 2020, we actually had a storm that was of similar magnitude of 2019. You probably don't remember anything about it because we didn't have a flood event, because we had unfrozen soils and dry soils. So we were able to handle that storm event much better than we were in 2019. So now we have an ongoing drought conditions, right? We dried out, the faucet got turned off, and we've been in drought condition ever since. So what we do now, the mitigative action, the controlling of greenhouse gases, that has a lot to do with our climate future. So as Deke pointed out, we are the problem, but we are also the solution, right? So you may have heard of these RCPs, representative concentration pathways. This is 8.5, so that just means that it's actually a radiative influence. So we're dialing our energy that we're receiving up, okay? So this, that's pretty light. The orange curve there, that's our current path, which we need to stay off of that current path. This RCP 4.5, that assumes action gets put into place now and within the next decade. So our rate of warming will be much less if we act now. The black curve there, that is the observed global average temperature. Nebraska temperatures has actually increased at about the same rate as the global average temperature. The magnitude, the ups and downs, as Deke mentioned, those are different between Nebraska and the globe, but the rate of change is pretty similar actually between Nebraska and the globe. Okay, so your climate future. Let's think about what is the Nebraska, if you all are still living here, what does that look like in 2050? So this image is a precipitation pattern throughout the course of the year. So on the left, we're going from January through December, the different months of the year. Right in the middle, that's kind of our current climate. So by current climate, I mean a 30-year average, what we're experiencing right now in terms of precipitation. That's right in that middle. So on the left is our past, and then on the right is our climate future for precipitation. So what you'll note is during the colder time of year, from about November through April or so, we're likely to be wetter than what we currently are. During the summer, when it's warm, when we typically get our highest precipitation of the year, we're going to be about 10% drier. So during the growing season, with warmer temperatures, less precipitation, there's going to be more demand for water resources. Think back to the flood event of 2019. If we get more rainfall or more snow, during the time of year when the ground is frozen, then those potential for a springtime snowmelt flood might increase. Okay, so Deke mentioned this. He did a great, I didn't see his presentation, but he did a great setup for what I was going to talk about. So I'll just give some local examples of these big weather items that he talked about. So here's an image of a flash flood event from Omaha last summer. I believe it was on August 7th, I think. So not every big weather event that we experience is solely caused by climate change, right? There's many other factors that do play into big weather, but the likelihood, the chances that we will have these extreme rain events, that is getting higher. So the climate of 2050 in Nebraska, when we get rain, there's likely to be more of it. So in general, when it rains, then it's going to pour. So what happens when that's the case is we get flash flooding, urban flooding. If you're driving around Omaha, Lincoln, in these urban areas, there's more opportunity for that flash flooding. If you come from a farm, you probably know that you want a nice, gentle rain. You don't want all your precipitation to come at one time. It's less effective. There's more that runs off. There's soil and nutrients that run off. So we'll have less of these nice, gentle, effective rainfalls. And I'll go back briefly to the flood event of 2019, where for these big events, timing can be everything. So I mentioned the setup that was in place for that winter, and when this big storm came along, so everything, the conditions were right for these big scale impacts that we had. So we had loss of life, we had lots of damages. This happens to be this photo from the community of Niobrara, Nebraska. We had roads cut off, access to water and food cut off. So lots of implications from this very large scale event. So the timing can really be everything when it comes to producing these big, large scale events. So staying on this theme of precipitation, so the likelihood for these quick onset, or some call them flash droughts, that's also going to increase. So normally we can go quickly from one extreme to another, and that's only going to be amplified. And sometimes our impacts are more, right, if we've been in one side of the extreme and then we go quickly to another side of the extreme. So that amplifies the impacts to a drought event, for example. What I'm showing here, it's a change in the U.S. Drought Monitor over the course of a 3-month time period. As I mentioned, 98% of the state is currently in drought. There's water restrictions in various parts of the state. There's significant implications for the agricultural community, for stream flows and fisheries and so forth. But you can see the parts of the state that are in yellow here, that's where we've had a rapid intensification of these drought conditions. We had a warm summer, and we had the 3rd driest summer on record here in Nebraska. Okay, so temperatures. If I tell you that Nebraska's average temperature will warm by about 5 degrees compared to what it is right now, that may not be very meaningful for you. It might, what does that translate to? What does that mean? Well, let's put a location on it. So central Nebraska's future climate, in terms of temperature, will be more like present-day southern Kansas. Okay, so that puts Grand Island about where Wichita is currently. Okay, so let's think about what industries are in southern Kansas. What do they grow in southern Kansas? What's viable for us if our average temperature warms by 5 degrees, our summer temperatures go up, our heat events go up? So Deke mentioned those nighttime lows really going up. If you have a cattle operation, how are you going to keep these cattle cool when it won't go below 80 degrees at night? If you have a confined feeding operation, what does that mean for you? Or if your cows are out in the pasture. So here I've just got a picture of wheat. Maybe that's something that Nebraska agricultural industry should be thinking about, is going from something that's going towards something that is less water and resource intensive. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question. So in general, if our temperatures are going to warm by a certain amount, then the amount of moisture available to hold in the atmosphere is going to increase. And I think it's a degree warming is about an 11% increase in moisture amount. So there's potential that I would think that we would likely see dew point temperatures also go up, because so a dew point temperature is kind of an anchor. It's a good indicator for where your nighttime lows are going to be. If our dew point temperatures are in the 70s, that's when we start to feel pretty uncomfortable. Then our nighttime lows are not going to go below that dew point temperature. So not good, not great news there. I'm not a huge fan of summer weather and temperatures. I'm a cold weather person, actually. So some other considerations here. So I've talked about precipitation. I've talked about temperatures. So December of last year, we had the warmest December on record. And by on record, I mean going back to 1895. That's about, in this country, when we started to have systematic observations at a scale enough where we can start a climatology. So again, I'm not saying that the storm event that we experienced in December of last year, climate change was maybe not the sole cause of it, but temperatures are warming up. The time at which we can potentially experience these storm events, it's outside of when we would normally think about it. So in the springtime, we have Severe Weather Awareness Week. In the summertime, we're used to tornado sirens and things like that happening, but not in December. December 13th and 14th, I believe. I was at home on a Zoom call for work, and there was shingles coming off of my roof when the derecho came through. So derechos are normally a mid to late summer event that happens, okay, not in December. So we had 30 tornadoes confirmed in Nebraska. Previous to 2021, we had 3 tornadoes in Nebraska's climate history. So we've been tracking tornadoes on a systematic basis for about 60 years or so. So up till last year, we had 3 in total in the month of December. And this year we have 30. So this is a great example of when these big weather weirding events, that the chances are for something like this to happen increased because of climate change. There's been a lot of wildfires in Nebraska this year. April was really windy in the state. I don't know if y'all remember that. It sticks out because I got a lot of calls from people saying, what's with this wind? And do we expect more of this? If we're planning an urban area, how should I orient my fence? I got all kinds of really interesting questions of, should I plan for windier conditions in April? And there's not really a simple answer for that. Wind is something that is related to climate change, but it's hard to say exactly for a particular location how much the winds are going to increase overall. But if we're going to be warmer, and if droughts are going to be quick onset or intensify, and if winds are going to be higher, that combination is not good for wildfire risk. This picture here is from the Road 702 fire that started in Kansas and moved north. There was a fire chief that lost his life in that fire. There was the Halsey fire that just happened this week. There was loss of life with that. So this potential for these wildfires to occur are going to be there. we must put resources in place to plan for these kinds of things. We will still get cold. And that doesn't mean that there isn't climate change. In my class, I show this picture of a congressperson, and this was, I don't know, 5-7 years ago or so, but he went into US Congress, and they were having a debate on the Senate floor, and he brings a snowball, and he said, "See, where's your global warming now? It's snowing, and it's outside of when it should be snowing in DC." Well, weather does still happen, and we do still have winter, and we will still get cold. In fact, in Nebraska, we have cooled about 5 degrees during the month of February in the last 30 years. We've seen more Arctic air outbreaks kind of in the central US in the last 30 years. Okay? Not every February is colder than the next, but in general, we've seen a cooling trend. So this image is from February of 2021. Do you all remember that month? That's those storms that came through. I remember classes at UNL were canceled because it was too cold. It reminded me of my Alaska days, because I used to think minus 25 was a relatively warm day, but that Alaska perspective has left me, and it seems pretty cold now. But we had rolling blackouts here in the Lincoln area. Lots of people were without power further to our south. That image is from Houston, Texas. So when we did have this big storm come through, there's lots of impacts, people having to go to shelters. And as Deke mentioned, he brought up a great point in that there are certain populations that it's much more difficult to cope. They are more vulnerable. And remember that climate change is disproportional. It doesn't impact you the same way as it impacts me. So another thing to keep in mind here. All right. Extremes that happen outside of Nebraska do matter. Sometimes we have this local perspective and we focus on what's around us, and that's fine. Everybody does that. But climate doesn't know any political border, right? So the changes that are taking place across the world have some sort of implication, either directly or indirectly, to us here in Nebraska. So an example of that I'm showing here is last summer there was a lot of wildfires in the western US. Wildfire risk will increase because of climate change. The dry areas of the world will get drier because of climate change. The wet areas will get wetter. So in the western half of the US, Southwest in particular, that's going to be hotter and drier and a greater likelihood or greater risk of wildfire. So if your immune system is compromised, if you have asthma, if you are sensitive to smoke, you are feeling the impacts of climate change, right? So Deke showed this, so I don't need to go into great detail with this, but if you are buying insurance for your house or for your apartment, then the cost to obtain that might go up because the cost of disasters are going up. So, and Deke brought up a good point in that it's not only a function of the weather hazard itself, but it's where we choose to live, our infrastructure. So there's a human and socioeconomic component to this trend. But the increase in the events themselves are going up. Okay, the last topic that I wanted to cover is perceptions of climate change. How do people feel about it? We're probably in a room where everybody kind of feels, in general, the same way about climate change. But that might not be the case among your other friends or family or the people that you talk to in the grocery store line. What is this climate change stuff? You know, I don't know that I believe it. You probably have heard some of those things. But in my role as state climatologist, I talk to I'm given, I don't know how many presentations to different groups, and that's from groups to natural resource districts, to the Nebraska Corn Board, to faith groups, from people who really care, people who I'm not sure that I should care about this. So I've got a lot of data, kind of anecdotal data, to understand how people feel about climate change in Nebraska. And so I'm showing you some national data results. There's this Yale project on climate change communication. They survey the US population every year. There's a number of questions that are asked. So if you're interested, you can dive into a lot of details on the website here. Do people in the US think that global warming is happening? A majority of us do. So the national average is 72%. I think that's also the percentage for Nebraska. So we think that it's happening. That's on the left. But on the right is, do we talk about global warming? I think it's 35% in the state. You can see how that map is blue now. So nationally, yeah, it's 35% as well. It's not something that we talk about. And it can be very difficult to have a conversation about climate change. But you can probably talk about, hey, what about this heavy rain event? Or did your power go out from this storm? Or do you have asthma, and are you impacted by wildfire smoke that we're getting? Or building codes. There's many ways that we can think about climate. It doesn't have to be scream climate change to actually talk about it. It can be our health, the economy, how we build and where we build. It can be about weather. I've met climate deniers, but I've never met a weather denier. So there is your gateway to talk about climate change, because weather and climate are related. So I wanted to kind of end with this quote. I won't say who I heard it from, but from the people that I've talked with, had the opportunity to meet with across Nebraska, this kind of sums up, I'd say a third at least of the population. I kind of put Nebraskans into three buckets. There's kind of what I call the harmful group that don't care or actively working against climate change action. And that bucket is getting fewer and fewer people, because things like the flood of 2019 happened. So somebody who was in that bucket has moved over to what I call the curious category. So this quote I'm putting in that curious. Well, I'm not sure that it's happening, but I do care about extreme weather. I care about the cost of insurance. I care about getting into my field to plant, okay? Or protecting the environment. So that's a significant percent of Nebraska's population is kind of in this bucket. And then we've got the active participants. That's people like everybody in this room. It's people that are in my class. It's people with Citizens Climate Lobby. It's those that are they're turning that anxiety into action and doing something about climate change. And there's a lot of that here in the state of Nebraska. So I just wanted to end with that. I'm sorry, I forgot of this. Do have a few more slides. What's going on? What's some good things that we can work toward and think about? A good thing that's happening is, so on this image, you see Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. You see that as an expansion activity. What's going to be taking place starting next year is we will get this, it's called Climate Adaptation Partnerships. So there's different universities. There's Nebraska Indian Community College that has been brought on board to tackle climate resilience for marginalized populations. So we are looking at indigenous communities and women landowners, working with those two communities in particular to increase their resilience to the impacts of climate change. There are others of these teams across the country that are focusing on regional climate issues. So that's really exciting, and I'm really, really happy to be a part of that. There is an update to the statewide climate report that was published in 2014. Don Wilhite, he was in the room. I don't see him now, but he led that effort. It was published by the university. Funding for an update actually passed the Nebraska unicameral this year to update that report. So I'm the person who is leading that, and that will come out in December of 2024. So that's really good. There's all kinds of things I'm sure that I could add to this, but I'm just showing you an illustration of good things that are happening and things you could potentially get involved in. There is a sustainability forum from the NU system that's taking place on November 21st here on Innovation Campus, so you can kind of mark the date for that. And lastly, I just wanted to mention, Deke brought this up, that it can be kind of a difficult topic to think about and to wrap your head around and to think about, do my actions mean anything? Are they worth anything? And for me, I do deal with college students, and I see and I feel their anxiety and the wanting people my age and older, people who are in power, to do something about it, and that maybe they won't do something about it. So I see and I feel that frustration. So something that really motivates me is everybody sitting in this room, okay? So I've got a couple of pictures here. The woman with the megaphone, that's Kat Werner. I met her when I was giving a talk in Omaha, and she was a high school student like you, okay? She took my class, my Intro to Climate Change class in 2019. There we are on the right. She is a senior. She graduated this year. She led in the development of the NU system sustainability goals. That was her job, to develop what should the NU system think about, what should be our goals for sustainability. That's her, that's you that is doing that. It's people like Kat, and it's all of you that are in this room that absolutely motivate me to keep doing what I'm doing. Because I feel sometimes what do they call it? Dark knowledge. This, what the future could potentially hold for us. And so I understand that it is difficult sometimes to overcome, but it's by far, for me, it's people like you in this room that are the biggest motivating factor for me to keep going and keep doing what I'm doing. So I really appreciate you and your efforts and what you do. And I'll put my contact information there. I'm located on East Campus of Hardin Hall. There's my email and phone number. You are more than welcome to reach out for anything that you might need. So thank you, and I'll take some questions if there's time.
Okay, so you might have already answered this question, but based off of the statistics for what Nebraska's climate is going to look like in 2050, so that's southern Kansas kind of climate, is Nebraska preparing for that at all? Or are we just kind of like, whatever happens, happens, and we'll deal with it then?
Yeah, good question. There's different actions that are taking place at the local level. So the things that I'm familiar with are, Lincoln's Climate Action Plan. Omaha is considering Climate Action Plan. So there's also natural resource districts that are looking at that, planning on that scale of the coming decades. So there's various pockets where these model predictions are informing the decisions that are taking place. The update to the climate report does include policy prescriptive measures. So that's something that is different from the previous climate report. So that will say, Nebraska, you need to reduce emissions by X amount by X date, or something along those lines. So that will give a goal for the state of Nebraska to work toward and achieve. So those are the things happening that I'm aware of. And there's a lot of grassroots organizations that are looking or working, say, in faith communities or at schools and at that local level to help put us on that turquoise curve and not on that orange curve, or put adaptation measures into place to make sure that we're prepared for the climate of 2050 and not looking backward at the climate of 1980. So
I was just going to ask, what are some of those like adaptations that we would need specifically? Like, what do you think that the legislation would enforce?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it kind of depends on agency that you're looking at. I guess I'll pick on a power industry, for example. So I just was invited to give a talk on climate change to the Nebraska Public Power District and Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy. So the regulators and the agencies that are being regulated are kind of coming together and talking through solutions. But one thing for the power industry would be looking at their carbon neutrality. You know, can they go to net zero by 2050, or looking at those kinds of goals? So that would be more of a mitigation action. In terms of adaptation, to me, thinking about how we build, you know, is our infrastructure, will it be able to withstand going quickly from one extreme to another? Will it be able to withstand those heavy rain events? You know, taking a look at our you know, traffic and how we move people and so forth. And is our built environment, is that going to be sustainable for the future climate? So yeah, I tend to look at it or explain it in terms of, we can look 10,000 years ago. We can think about the natural cycle. They're called Milankovitch cycles, and there's shifts in the orbit of the Earth and how the Earth is tilted on its axis, and there is natural variability, and that does happen. But what did Earth look like 10,000 years ago? Okay. So that's something that I talk about, is there's human civilization and there's the way that we live and work and move and the food that we grow right now. But you can't really compare that to what happened 10,000 years ago, or you can't equate the two. Or oftentimes I will just get the person to start talking and not about ice ages or the dinosaur era or things like that. That's in the past, and we're not concerned about that. You know, tell me how you feel about this. What changes have you seen where you live? Start talking about something that is not controversial, and don't even talk about climate change, but just start with what the person is comfortable with something that's relevant today, here and now, and not thousands of years ago. Yeah.
How will the temperature increase affect Nebraska's main crops, such as corn and soy? And a follow-up question is, how will that affect like food supply and our economy, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one of those things that I hope the various industries are looking at this kind of thing. I mean, if we think about, you know, Deke brought up the nighttime low temperatures, and corn plants, they like to cool off, and, you know, especially when they're silking, going on pollination. And if they're not able to cool off, or the daytime temperatures are too high, then pollination isn't going to happen. So there will be impacts to yield in that case. I also think about how much water and resources are going to be necessary to sustain. If you look at Nebraska's current agricultural production, is that viable in a warmer and drier world? You know, that's a good question. To me, it's something that we should be actively looking at. And, you know, sometimes I'll tell people, I'm not saying that you shouldn't keep growing what you're growing. You know, I'm saying that I don't know if you can keep those practices going, if they will be viable. But it's the amount of warmth that we'll have along with the dry conditions, that will put our current agricultural practices into question of whether that's viable or not.
That we have for questions. Let's give Martha another round of applause, and thank you for coming.